The rain fell in steady gray sheets over the Normandy countryside, a relentless drizzle that had persisted for 3 days. It turned the rich, dark earth to a clinging mud that sucked at the boots of the two men huddled in a shallow foxhole, their world reduced to a circle of damp wool, cold steel, and the coppery taste of fear. Captain John Miller of the 2nd Ranger Battalion pulled the collar of his soaked field jacket tighter, his eyes scanning the skeletal remains of an apple orchard through the mist. Beside him, Private First Class James Caparzo, a kid from the Bronx who'd lied about his age, shivered uncontrollably. "You think they're out there, Cap?" Caparzo whispered, his voice thin and reedy against the drumming rain. "They're always out there," Miller replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that betrayed a fatigue bone-deep. He didn't need to specify who they were. The Germans, the Fritzes, the enemy. Their presence was a constant, oppressive weight, felt in the unnatural silence of the woods and the occasional, distant crump of an artillery shell. It was October 1944. The heady days of the D-Day landings were a blood-soaked memory, the breakout from St. Lo a brutal, grinding affair. Now, they were deep in the hedgerow country, the bocage, a nightmare landscape of ancient, earthen banks and dense, tangled roots that turned every field into a potential ambush, and every advance into a meter-by-meter slaughter. Miller's mind drifted back, as it often did in these quiet, terrifying moments, to the beginning. Not the beginning of the war for him, that had started in the sun-bleached rocks of Sicily and the bitter mountains of Italy, but the beginning of this specific, soul-crushing push into France. 6 weeks earlier, his battalion had been pulled from the line for a brief, precious rest. The respite had lasted 36 hours. They were summoned to a command tent, the air thick with the smell of damp canvas and cheap coffee. A colonel in a crisply pressed uniform, his boots gleaming with a polish none of the frontline men could ever hope to achieve, had stood before a large map. "The strategic situation is critical, gentlemen," the colonel had begun, his pointer tapping a location deep behind the current German lines. "Intelligence from the French resistance indicates the Germans are consolidating a massive armored force here, in the forest of St. Gervais. They're calling it Panzergruppe West. If they are allowed to launch a coordinated counteroffensive, they could split our forces, drive a wedge right back to the beaches." He paused, letting the gravity of the statement sink in. "Your battalion, along with elements of the 101st Airborne, has been tasked with a deep penetration raid. You will bypass the main German defensive lines, move through the countryside, and infiltrate the forest. Your objective is simple: locate the Panzer Group's command and control center and eliminate it. Destroy their communications, kill their senior officers, create chaos. Without its head, the body will be useless." A major had cleared his throat. "Sir, that's over 60 miles behind enemy lines. It's suicide." The colonel's face had remained impassive. "It's necessary, Major. The entire Normandy campaign may hinge on this. You'll have air support where possible, and the resistance has promised guides. A man named Luke, he's supposedly the best they have, knows the land like the back of his hand." And so it began. They had moved out at dusk, a long, ragged column of grim-faced men weighed down by weapons, explosives, and enough rations for 5 days. They were 120 strong then. Now Miller looked around at the handful of faces he could see in the surrounding foxholes. Maybe 40. The rest were dead, captured, or left wounded in ditches they couldn't afford to defend. Their guide, Luke, had met them on the second night. He was a gaunt man in his 50s, with eyes that held a flat, ancient hatred. He spoke little, moved with a feral silence that unnerved even the Rangers, and his knowledge of the land was, as promised, preternatural. He led them through drainage ditches, along forgotten game trails, and through the cellars of bombed-out farmhouses, avoiding German patrols with an uncanny instinct. But the Germans were not fools. Their commander in this sector, Oberstleutnant Erich von Heldorf, was a different kind of predator. A Prussian aristocrat with a cold, analytical mind, he had anticipated such tactics. He didn't just defend the roads. He saturated the countryside with roving patrols of experienced Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, and vicious Gestapo counterintelligence squads tasked with rooting out the resistance. The bocage was not a place to hide. It was a killing field. The memories of their journey were a series of stark, brutal tableaus in Miller's mind. He remembered the first contact, a frantic, close-range ambush in a sunken lane, the stutter of a German MG-42, the terrifying ripping canvas sound it made, scything down 3 men before they could even raise their rifles. The frantic return fire, the smell of cordite and blood, and the sight of Corporal Henderson, a man who'd survived Italy, clutching at his throat as it bloomed crimson. He remembered the farmhouse near St. Clair. Luke had insisted it was a safe house. They'd found the family inside, a farmer, his wife, 2 young children shot in the back of the head, a message from the Gestapo, a single word scrawled on the wall in blood, Verräter, traitor. They had buried them in the orchard behind the house, a silent, furious ceremony under a moonless sky. He remembered the endless, grinding tension, the inability to sleep for more than a few minutes at a time, the constant, low-grade hunger as rations dwindled, the blisters that became sores, the sores that became infected, the way a man's spirit could be eroded, day by day, like a stone under a steady drip of water. And through it all, there was Luke. The Frenchman's hatred was a cold, hard flame. One night as they sheltered in a ruined church, he had spoken to Miller, his voice barely a whisper. "They took my daughter, Captain," he'd said, staring into the small, shielded flame of a candle. "Elise, for working with the Maquis. She is 17. They sent her east to one of their camps. I do not expect to see her again, so now I have only this. The killing. It is the only thing that is real." Miller had no answer for that. He had a wife, Sarah, back in Pennsylvania. Her letters, growing increasingly infrequent, were worn soft at the edges from being read and reread. She wrote of the garden, of the neighbors, of her work at the factory. Her words a fragile bridge to a world of sanity and peace that was beginning to feel like a dream. He feared that bridge was burning behind him with every step he took deeper into this green hell. The rain began to ease, fading to a fine, cold mist. Miller checked his watch. 4:30. Dawn was a reluctant smudge of gray in the east. They had to move. They were still a day's hard march from the fringes of the St. Gervais forest. He nudged Caparzo. "Pass the word. We move in 5. Silence absolute." The order was passed along in hushed tones, a ripple of tense movement through the waterlogged positions. Men checked their weapons, slung packs onto aching shoulders, their faces pale and etched with exhaustion. Luke appeared at the edge of the foxhole, materializing from the gloom like a ghost. His face was grim. "The Germans," he murmured, "they are changing their patterns. The patrols are thicker. They know we are here or they suspect something big is moving." "Can you get us through?" Miller asked. Luke gave a short, sharp nod. "There is a way. A valley, the Vallée des Larmes, the Valley of Tears. It is narrow, steep-sided, dangerous, but the Germans do not like to patrol it. They think it is a death trap." "Is it?" Caparzo asked, his voice trembling slightly. Luke's eyes met his. "It is what we make of it, mon ami." They moved out, a single file of shadows in the pre-dawn twilight. Luke led, his movements fluid and silent. Miller was next, then Caparzo, followed by the rest of the ragged company. Sergeant Horvath, the rock-solid platoon sergeant, Medic Wade, whose gentle hands had saved countless lives, and the others, Reiben, Jackson, Mellish, men whose names and faces were now as familiar to Miller as his own. The Valley of Tears was aptly named. It was a deep, V-shaped cut in the earth, choked with thorny undergrowth and slick, moss-covered rocks. A shallow stream, swollen by the recent rains, gurgled along its bottom. The sides were so steep that they had to move in a crouch, one hand often gripping roots or rocks to keep from sliding into the stream. The air was cold and heavy, with the smell of damp earth and decay. For 2 hours they pushed on, the only sounds the squelch of their boots, the gentle rush of the stream, and their own labored breathing. The tension was a physical thing, a wire stretched taut in the pit of Miller's stomach. This was too easy. The Germans were many things, but they were not negligent. His fears were confirmed when Luke, at the head of the column, froze, raising a clenched fist. Everyone stopped, sinking into whatever cover they could find. Miller crept forward, his Thompson submachine gun held ready. Luke was staring at a point on the eastern ridge, his body rigid. "There," he breathed. Miller followed his gaze. At first he saw nothing but the tangled foliage and the gray sky. Then, a flicker of movement. A shape, angular and gray-green, resolved itself against the skyline. It was a German soldier, a Feldmütze on his head, his profile sharp as he scanned the valley below. Then another, and another. A full patrol moving parallel to them along the ridge. They were perfectly positioned. The Rangers were in the kill zone, trapped like rats in a barrel. Miller held his breath. If they were spotted, it would be a massacre. He could feel the collective fear of his men radiating up the line. He made a slow, deliberate hand signal. "Hold position. Absolute silence." The German patrol moved with a professional, unhurried pace. They were Fallschirmjäger, their smocks a distinctive splinter pattern. Elite troops. They paused for a moment, less than 100 yards away, and one of them lit a cigarette. Miller could see the glow of the match, hear the faint murmur of their conversation carried on the damp air. They were laughing about something. The moment stretched, agonizing and infinite. A drop of cold water traced a path from Miller's helmet down his neck. He didn't dare move to wipe it away. He could see Caparzo, a few yards behind him, his eyes wide with terror, his knuckles white on his Moen Garand. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the Germans moved on, their figures disappearing over the crest of the ridge. The sound of their footsteps faded away. Miller let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked at Luke. The Frenchman's face was a mask of cold contempt. He gave a slight nod. The immediate danger had passed. It took another hour to navigate the remainder of the valley. When they finally emerged, the sun was struggling to break through the overcast, casting a weak, watery light over the land. Before them lay a rolling plain of farmland, and beyond, a dark, brooding line of trees that stretched to the horizon. The forest of St. Gervais. They had reached the edge of the map, the heart of the beast. They took cover in a copse of trees at the edge of a fallow field, the forest looming a mile or so in the distance. The men collapsed, sucking on canteens and chewing on hardtack, their bodies trembling with released adrenaline and exhaustion. Miller took out his binoculars and scanned the tree line. It was impenetrable, a wall of ancient oaks and pines. There were no obvious paths, no signs of movement. It looked peaceful, deceptively so. Sergeant Horvath crawled over, his broad, dependable face creased with worry. "Cap'n, we're down to 38 effectives. Ammo is low. Morale is lower. You sure about this?" "No, Mike," Miller said softly, not lowering the binoculars. "I'm not sure about anything anymore, but the order stands. We go in." As he scanned, something caught his eye, a flicker of light deep within the forest. A reflection, a vehicle. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. Luke joined them. "The forest is old, Captain. It has its own secrets. The Germans will be on the main trails, the fire breaks. We must go through the thick of it. It will be slow, very slow." "Do it," Miller said. They waited until full dark, a moonless, inky blackness that felt like a shroud. The forest was even more forbidding up close, a solid mass of shadow that seemed to swallow the very light. The air grew cold and still, and the sounds of the night, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of some small creature, were magnified, every one a potential threat. Luke led them into the darkness. The going was torturous. Thorns tore at their uniforms and skin. Fallen logs, slick with rot, had to be climbed over or crawled under. The forest floor was a thick carpet of leaves that deadened sound but also hid treacherous holes and roots. They moved at a snail's pace, a chain of men connected only by touch, and the faint, whispered warnings passed back down the line. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few hours, Luke halted them. He pointed ahead. Through a break in the trees they could see a wide, gravel-paved road, a German military road. It was empty, illuminated faintly by the starlight filtering through the canopy. "We cross here," Luke whispered. "One at a time. Run, do not walk." Miller nodded. He tapped Horvath on the shoulder. "You first, Mike. Get across, set up a perimeter." Horvath didn't hesitate. He dashed across the 20-foot-wide road, his bulky form disappearing into the darkness on the other side. A soft whistle signaled he was safe. One by one the men followed. Caparzo, Reiben, Jackson, each dash a heart-pounding moment of vulnerability. Miller counted them off in his head. 35, 36, 37. He was about to send the next man when he heard it. A low, mechanical rumble growing steadily louder from the east. Headlights, faint at first then brightening, slicing through the forest gloom. "Down! Everyone down!" Miller hissed. The men still on his side of the road flattened themselves into the undergrowth. Miller pressed his face into the damp leaves, his heart hammering against his ribs. The vehicle was close. Too close. It was a German half-track, a SDKFZ. 251, its engine roaring as it lumbered down the road. It was followed by two more, and then a pair of motorcycles with sidecars. A full squad. The headlights swept over their hiding places, illuminating the terrified whites of Caparzo's eyes just a few feet away. For a terrifying second, Miller was certain they had been seen. But the convoy rolled past, the sound of its engines fading into the distance. The forest returned to its oppressive silence. Miller let out a shaky breath. "Okay," he whispered. "Let's go." Last three now. The remaining men scrambled across. Miller was the last. He took one final look behind him, then sprinted across the gravel, his boots crunching loudly in the silence. He dove into the undergrowth on the other side, Horvath's strong hand pulling him to cover. "Jesus, Captain," Horvath breathed. "That was too damn close." They regrouped and pressed on, the forest growing even denser. The air was thick and cold. The sense of being watched, of being hunted, was now overwhelming. They were inside the lion's den. An hour later, Luke stopped again. He held up his hand, his head cocked. He pointed, not with his finger but with his chin, towards a faint, orange glow visible through the trees ahead. It was not the warm glow of a campfire. It was the harsh, electric glare of floodlights. Miller motioned for the men to take cover. He, Horvath, and Luke crawled forward on their bellies, moving with painstaking slowness until they reached the edge of a small, rocky outcrop. The sight that met their eyes stole the breath from Miller's lungs. Below them, in a massive, man-made clearing, was a German command post, but it was unlike any they had ever seen. It was a fortress. Dozens of vehicles were parked in neat rows, Kubelwagens, Opel Blitz trucks, and several armored cars. Large camouflage tents were set up, their sides open to reveal banks of radio equipment, maps covering entire walls. Soldiers moved with purpose, their movements crisp and disciplined. This was no mere outpost. This was a nerve center, and in the center of it all, surrounded by a hive of activity, was a colossal, monstrous shape. It was a command vehicle, but on a scale Miller could scarcely comprehend. It was built on the chassis of a Tiger II tank, but the turret had been removed and replaced with a vast, armored superstructure, bristling with radio antennas and a large, rotating radar dish. It was a mobile headquarters, a behemoth of steel and technology. This was the heart of Panzergruppe West. "My God," Horvath whispered, his voice full of awe and dread. "Will you look at that?" But Miller's eyes were drawn to something else. Parked near the command behemoth was a smaller, but equally sinister vehicle, a black Mercedes staff car. And standing beside it, deep in conversation with a group of senior officers, was a man whose profile was chillingly familiar from intelligence briefings. It was Oberstleutnant Erich von Heldorf. He was tall, ramrod straight, his uniform immaculate even in the field. He held a swagger stick under his arm and gestured with a gloved hand towards a map held by an aide. He was the architect of the death that had stalked them for weeks. He was the reason they were here. The objective was right in front of them. But the sight of the heavily fortified position, the number of troops, the sheer scale of the defenses, made the mission seem not just suicidal, but utterly impossible. Luke's hand gripped Miller's arm, his fingers like iron. He was pointing towards a smaller, isolated tent at the edge of the clearing, guarded by two SS soldiers. It was set apart from the others, and from its opening, a faint, muffled sound could be heard. It was the sound of a woman sobbing. Luke's face, in the reflected glow of the floodlights, was a terrifying mixture of hope, despair, and a fury so profound it seemed to radiate heat. "Elise," he breathed, the word a prayer and a curse. Miller's mind raced, the carefully constructed plan disintegrating in the face of this overwhelming reality. They were 38 exhausted, underarmed men facing what looked like a battalion-strength force, protected by armor and entrenched in a fortified position. Destroying the command center would require getting explosives directly onto that command vehicle or into the main communications tent. It was a task for a small army, not a battered remnant of a ranger platoon. And now, there was the girl, Luke's daughter, a complication that was also a searing human tragedy. He looked at the faces of his men, pale and gaunt in the darkness. He saw the fear, the exhaustion, but also a flicker of the hardened resolve that had brought them this far. They were waiting for his order, for a plan, for a miracle. He had to make a decision. A dozen different scenarios, each more desperate than the last, flashed through his mind. A direct assault was madness. A stealthy infiltration seemed nearly impossible. Waiting for an opportunity could mean missing their only chance. He was about to turn to Horvath and Luke to whisper the beginnings of a half-formed, reckless idea when a new sound cut through the low hum of the command post. It was the sharp, metallic click of a safety catch being released directly behind them. A voice, cold, precise, and heavily accented, spoke from the shadows at their backs. "Do not move, Amerikaner. Keep your hands where I can see them. The hunt is over." The world froze. The low hum of the German command post, the distant sob from the tent, the ragged sound of his own breathing, it all receded into a dull roar in Captain Miller's ears. The cold, hard reality of the German rifle muzzle he couldn't see pressed against his soul with more force than any physical touch. He slowly, very slowly, raised his hands, his eyes locking with Horvath's. The sergeant's face was a granite mask of resignation and fury. "Langsam," the voice behind them commanded. "Slowly, stand up, all of you." Miller, Horvath, and Luke rose from the damp earth, their movements stiff, their hands in the air. From the shadows of the pines, three figures emerged. They were not the Fallschirmjäger they had seen on the ridge. These men wore the field gray of the Wehrmacht, but their insignia marked them as part of an elite reconnaissance unit. The one in the lead, a corporal with a sharp, intelligent face and cold eyes, held a St. G44 assault rifle with a professional ease. The other two covered them with Carabiner 98,000 rifles. "You are very quiet," the corporal said, his English clipped, "but not quiet enough. We have been tracking you since you crossed the road, a careless boot print in the mud." He gestured with his rifle. "Move. Down to the clearing." They were marched down the slope at gunpoint, their minds racing, their hopes crumbling to dust. The sheer scale of the encampment grew more intimidating with every step. They passed within feet of the Black Merceds. Oberstleutnant von Helldorf had turned from his map table and was watching their approach, a faint, almost academic curiosity on his aristocratic features. He was younger than Miller had expected, with a lean, predatory handsomeness and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. "Ah," von Helldorf said, his voice a calm, cultured baritone. "The American raiding party. We have been expecting you, or at least something like you." He stepped forward, his polished boots crunching on the gravel. His gaze swept over them, lingering for a moment on Luke. "And you have brought a local guide. How predictable." He snapped an order in German. Within seconds, the rest of the ranger platoon was being rounded up from their hiding places in the trees. There were shouts, a single, short burst of gunfire that made Miller flinch, and then his men were being herded into the center of the clearing, their hands on their heads, surrounded by a ring of German soldiers. Miller's heart sank as he counted. They'd lost 2 more in the brief struggle. 36. They were disarmed with brutal efficiency. Miller felt the familiar weight of his Thompson being ripped from his shoulder, his Colt M1911 taken from its holster. He saw Caparzo's moan Garand clatter to the ground, saw the despair in the young private's eyes. Von Heldorf walked slowly along the line of prisoners, studying them as a biologist might study specimens. "Captain John Miller, 2nd Ranger Battalion," he said, stopping in front of him. "Your reputation precedes you, Sicily, Salerno, a tenacious fighter." He then turned to Luke. "And you, the ghost they call Luke. We have a file on you in Paris. You have been a thorn in our side for a long time." Luke said nothing. His entire being was focused on the isolated tent, from which the soft sobbing could still be faintly heard. Von Heldorf followed his gaze. A cruel smile touched his lips. "Ah, yes, that is a separate matter, a personal one." He gestured to one of the SS guards. "Bring her out." The guard ducked into the tent and emerged a moment later, pulling a young woman by the arm. She was painfully thin, dressed in a torn and dirty dress, her face bruised and streaked with tears. But her eyes, when they found Luke, held a fierce, unbroken light. "Papa!" she cried out, struggling against the guard's grip. Luke took a step forward, a raw animal sound tearing from his throat. A German rifle butt slammed into his kidney, driving him to his knees with a grunt of pain. "Elise!" he gasped. Von Heldorf looked between them, his satisfaction evident. "A touching reunion. We caught her 3 days ago, trying to sabotage a railway line. She was surprisingly resilient under interrogation. But she would not give you up, Luke. She protected you to the end. A foolish loyalty." Miller's mind was a vortex of desperation. They were disarmed, surrounded, and the mission was a catastrophic failure. But as he watched von Heldorf preen, a cold, calculating part of his brain began to work. The German officer was proud, arrogant. He saw them as a prize, an intellectual puzzle to be solved before their execution. That arrogance was a weakness. "You talk too much," Miller said, his voice rough. "Just get on with it." Von Heldorf turned back to him, his eyebrow raised. "With your execution, so impatient, Captain. But the night is young, and you are the most interesting thing to happen in this dreary forest in weeks. I want to know how you got here. I want to know your specific orders. The information will be instructive." He was going to interrogate them. That meant time, and time was the one commodity, however meager, that they now possessed. "You'll get nothing from us," Sergeant Horvath growled. "We shall see," von Heldorf said mildly. He ordered his men to secure the prisoners. They were forced to sit on the cold ground, their hands bound behind their backs with rough cord. A machine gun nest was repositioned to cover them, the crew of the MG-42 watching them with bored professionalism. Von Heldorf gave another series of orders. The command post, which had momentarily paused to watch the spectacle, returned to its work. The low hum of generators, the chatter of teleprinters, the murmur of radio operators resumed. The colossal command vehicle stood like a silent king amidst its court. Miller studied it, his soldier's eye noting details. The access hatches, the vulnerable points where the armor was thinnest around the vision ports and the base of the radar dish. It was a futile exercise, but it was all he had left. He glanced at his men. They were a picture of defeat. Caparzo was staring at the ground, his shoulders slumped. Reiben was muttering curses under his breath. Medic Wade had a calm, almost serene look on his face, as if he had already made his peace. But then Miller saw something else. Private Jackson, the lanky sniper from Tennessee, was working his wrists ever so slightly, a subtle, twisting motion. The Germans had bound them, but they had done it hastily. Jackson was testing the bonds. Hope, a tiny, treacherous spark, flickered in the darkness of Miller's spirit. Von Heldorf retired to his command tent with his senior staff, leaving them under the watchful eyes of the guards. The night wore on. The temperature dropped further, and a chill mist began to coil through the clearing. The prisoners shivered in their soaked uniforms. Every few minutes, a junior officer would come out, Select one of the rangers and take him into a smaller tent for questioning. The men always returned, pale and shaken, some with fresh bruises, but none talked. They had been through too much together to break now. Miller was the last to be taken. Two soldiers hauled him to his feet and marched him into the interrogation tent. It was Spartan, containing only a field table, two chairs, and a powerful electric lamp that shone directly into his face. Von Heldorf sat on the other side of the table, a folder open before him. "Sit, Captain." Miller remained standing until a guard shoved him into the chair. "Your mission is a failure," von Heldorf began, steepling his fingers. "You are all going to die here. That is an inevitability. The only variable is the manner of your death. You can die quickly, or you can die after you have watched every one of your men die slowly before you. The choice is yours. Tell me about the resistance networks north of St. Lo. The names. The drop points." Miller stared past the blinding light, focusing on a knot in the wooden tent pole. "Go to hell." Von Heldorf sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. "Such a waste. You are a professional soldier, Captain. I can see that. This stubbornness is not professionalism, it is sentiment. It is a disease that weakens your entire army." He leaned forward. "Let me offer you a different perspective. The counteroffensive Panzergruppe West launches at dawn. By this time tomorrow, my tanks will have shattered your lines at Avranches. We will drive your forces back into the sea. The war in Europe will be prolonged by a year, perhaps more. Hundreds of thousands more will die. For what? For your silence." He was lying. He had to be. It was a classic interrogation technique. Magnify the stakes to break the subject's will. But the sheer conviction in his voice sent a chill down Miller's spine. "You're bluffing," Miller said. "Am I?" Von Heldorf opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was an aerial reconnaissance photo, showing row upon row of Panzer V Panther tanks, camouflaged under netting in a different part of the forest. It was dated 2 days earlier. "This is just one of our assembly areas. We have 3 more just as large. You have stumbled upon the brain, Captain, but the muscle is elsewhere, poised and ready." The photo looked real. The intelligence they had received from the French resistance, the very reason for this suicide mission, was correct. A sense of profound, crushing responsibility settled on Miller. The fate of the entire beachhead of the thousands of men on the front lines might literally be in his hands, and they were tied behind his back. He said nothing. Von Heldorf watched him for a long moment, then nodded to himself. "Very well. We will do this the other way." He stood. "Bring in the boy." The guard left and returned a moment later, shoving Private Caparzo into the tent. The young private's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "This one is young," von Heldorf said, circling Caparzo like a shark. "He has his whole life ahead of him, or he did." He stopped behind Caparzo. "Tell me the name of your contact in Isigny, Captain, or I will shoot this boy in the knee, then the other knee, then the elbows. My medic will keep him conscious for the entire procedure." Caparzo began to tremble. "Cap." Miller's blood ran cold. He looked into Caparzo's eyes, seeing the kid from the Bronx who'd lied to be here, who'd shivered in a foxhole just hours ago. He thought of Sarah, of the garden, of the world of sanity he was fighting for. He couldn't condemn one of his own to that. But he couldn't betray the resistance, the people who had risked everything to help them. His silence was a scream inside his head. Von Heldorf drew his Luger pistol. He pressed the muzzle against the back of Caparzo's right knee. "Last chance, Captain." The sound of the shot was deafening in the confined space. Caparzo screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony, and collapsed to the floor, clutching his leg. Blood welled between his fingers. Miller surged to his feet, a roar of pure fury tearing from his throat. The guards wrestled him back into his chair. He stared at Caparzo, who was sobbing in pain on the ground, and then at von Heldorf, who was calmly reholstering his weapon. "A necessary demonstration," the German said. "Medic." A German medic entered and began roughly bandaging Caparzo's leg, eliciting another cry of pain. As the medic worked, Miller forced himself to look, to remember the face of the man who had done this. Von Heldorf's expression was one of detached analysis. There was no pleasure in it, no rage. That made it infinitely worse. "Take him away," von Heldorf ordered. The guards dragged the weeping Caparzo out of the tent. The German officer turned back to Miller. "The next one will be the sniper, Jackson. I will put out his eyes. Think on that, Captain. You have until dawn." He was led back out into the clearing and thrown down beside his men. Horvath and the others had heard the shot and Caparzo's scream. Their faces were grim. "Caparzo?" Horvath asked, his voice tight. "Leg wound," Miller said, the words ash in his mouth. "He'll live, for now." He quickly scanned their faces. Jackson gave him an almost imperceptible nod. The bonds on his wrists were loose. The spark of hope grew a little brighter. Luke, who had been watching the isolated tent where Elise was held, turned to Miller. His eyes were burning coals in the darkness. "Captain," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "they are overconfident. They have us. They know it. The guards are bored. They are watching us, but they are not watching the forest." "What are you thinking?" Miller whispered back. "My daughter is in that tent. There are only 2 guards. If there was a distraction, a big one, I could get to her. And I have this." He subtly shifted his body, and Miller saw that Luke had somehow managed to conceal a small, sharp knife, probably a fishing knife, in the seam of his trousers. The Germans had missed it in their search. A distraction. Miller's mind, honed by years of combat, began to assemble the pieces. Jackson's loose bonds, Luke's knife, the Germans' arrogance, the location of the machine gun nest, the fuel drums he had spotted near the parked trucks. It was a plan born of utter desperation, a plan with 1,000 ways to fail and only one narrow, razor-thin path to success. But it was a plan. He leaned closer to Horvath and Luke, his voice a barely audible whisper. "Listen carefully. We're not going to wait for dawn. We're going to make our move, on my signal." He began to outline the insane, audacious scheme, his words painting a picture of chaos and fire and one last, desperate charge into the jaws of death. The next hour was an eternity of strained silence. The guards changed, the new shift looking just as bored as the last. The activity in the command post began to slow as the night deepened. Even von Heldorf retired to his personal quarters, a small, camouflaged tent near the command vehicle. The floodlights cast long, stark shadows. The moon, a sliver of bone, broke through the clouds, bathing the clearing in an eerie, silver light. Miller watched the guards, timing their patterns. The 2 SS men outside Elise's tent remained vigilant, but the soldiers covering the prisoners were less so. One lit a cigarette. Another leaned on his rifle, his gaze wandering. It was time. He caught Jackson's eye and gave a single, slow nod. Jackson closed his eyes for a second, took a deep, silent breath, and then exploded into motion. With a powerful twist of his wrists, he snapped the weakened cord. In one fluid movement, he was on his feet, lunging not away from the guards, but towards the nearest one. He was like a striking snake. Before the German could even shout, Jackson had wrested the rifle from his hands, reversed it, and slammed the butt into the man's face with a sickening crunch. "Now," Miller roared. The clearing erupted into chaos. As the other guards swung their weapons towards Jackson, Miller, Horvath, and the other rangers nearest them surged to their feet, using their bodies as living battering rams. They couldn't shoot, but they could fight. A close-quarters brawl erupted, a brutal, silent struggle of fists, elbows, and heads. Men grunted and swore in 2 languages. Luke didn't join the fight. The moment the distraction began, he was a phantom, melting into the shadows at the edge of the clearing, his knife held low. He moved towards his daughter's tent. Miller, meanwhile, was fighting for his life. He drove his shoulder into a guard's stomach, sending him stumbling back into the machine gun nest. The crew of the MG-42, confused by the close-quarters melee, couldn't fire without hitting their own men. One of them stood up, trying to clear the weapon, and Miller kicked him hard in the chest. "The fuel drums," Miller yelled to Horvath. "By the trucks." Horvath, locked in a bear hug with a large German, nodded. He headbutted his opponent, breaking his nose, then shoved him away and began sprinting towards the parked vehicles. Alarms began to blare across the camp. Shouts in German echoed as soldiers poured from their tents, pulling on helmets and fumbling with their weapons. The carefully ordered command post was descending into pandemonium. Miller saw Luke reach the isolated tent. One of the SS guards turned, raising his rifle, but Luke was faster. He ducked under the barrel and drove his knife up and under the man's ribcage. The guard gasped, his eyes wide with surprise, and slumped to the ground. The second guard fired his rifle, the shot going wide as Luke closed the distance. They fell into a desperate struggle. Horvath reached the fuel drums. He wrestled one over, the pungent smell of gasoline filling the air. He ripped a strip of cloth from a dead German's uniform, soaked it in the fuel, and wrapped it around the handle of his entrenching tool. He lit it with a dead guard's Zippo. The flame caught, a sudden, beautiful, terrifying flower of light in the darkness. "Fire in the hole," he bellowed, and heaved the flaming drum towards a cluster of parked Kubelwagens. The explosion was not the Hollywood fireball Miller had half expected, but it was devastating enough. The drum erupted in a whoop of flame, spraying burning gasoline everywhere. One of the Kubelwagens caught fire, its fuel tank igniting a moment later with a louder, more satisfying boom. The fire leaped to a nearby tent, which went up like a torch. The chaos was now absolute. The German soldiers were no longer a cohesive force, but a mob of confused individuals. The primary goal of any soldier in a surprise attack, to regain unit cohesion, was shattered. They were shooting at shadows at their own men at the raging fire. In the midst of this, Miller saw his chance. The command vehicle, its crew, startled by the explosion, had emerged from a hatch to see what was happening. "Rangers! To me!" Miller shouted, scooping up a fallen M40 submachine gun. A handful of his men, Reiben, Mellish, and a few others, broke away from their individual fights and formed a knot around him. They were a tiny island of purpose in a sea of anarchy. They charged towards the behemoth. Bullets whizzed past them. A ranger to Miller's left cried out and fell. They returned fire on the move, their shots wild but forcing the German crews to keep their heads down. They reached the massive steel tracks of the command vehicle. "Grenades! Into the hatches!" Miller ordered. Reiben pulled a German stick grenade from his belt, yanked the cord, and lobbed it through an open vision port. They heard a muffled shout from inside, followed by a dull thud. Smoke began to pour from the port. At Elise's tent, Luke had finally overpowered the second SS guard, silencing him with his knife. He tore open the tent flap. "Elise!" He emerged a moment later, half carrying, half dragging his daughter. They were both crying, a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief. But their escape was cut off. A squad of German soldiers, finally organizing under a sharp-voiced sergeant, was moving to secure the command vehicle, their fire becoming more accurate. Luke and Elise were pinned down behind a stack of crates. Miller and his men were also pinned. They had caused immense damage, but they were now trapped against the immobile hull of the command vehicle. The initial surprise was over. The Germans were regrouping. The machine gun nest, now clear of the brawl, began to traverse towards them, its deadly muzzle seeking targets. It was then that Oberstleutnant von Helldorf emerged from his quarters. He was not panicked. He was furious. He held a Walther P38 pistol and was barking orders, his voice cutting through the din. He saw Miller and his men huddled by his prized command vehicle, saw the smoke pouring from it, and his face contorted with rage. "Kill them! Kill them all!" he screamed, pointing directly at Miller. The machine gunner adjusted his aim. This was it. The final act. Miller looked at Horvath, at Reiben, at the few faces that remained. He saw the acceptance in their eyes. They had done what they could. They had torn the head off the beast, even if they were about to be consumed by it. But then, a single, sharp crack rang out, different from the stutter of the MP40s and the roar of the MG42. The German machine gunner slumped over his weapon, a dark hole appearing in his temple. Everyone, German and American alike, froze for a split second. From the tree line at the edge of the clearing, a new storm broke. It was a storm of American steel. The sharp, authoritative report of Moan Garand's, the heavier thump of a Browning automatic rifle, and the familiar, comforting chatter of an American .30 caliber machine gun. Tracers ripped through the darkness, stitching lines of fire through the German positions. Miller stared, uncomprehending. Then he saw them. Figures in American uniforms emerging from the forest, firing from the hip as they advanced. At their head was a big man with a bar, his face set in a grimace of determination. It was the missing major from the briefing, the one who had called the mission suicide. They hadn't been the only raid. They had been the diversion. The Germans, caught between Miller's men and this new, fresh force, broke. The sergeant who had been organizing the defense went down, hit multiple times. Soldiers began to throw down their weapons and raise their hands. Others turned and fled into the forest. Von Heldorf stood his ground, a statue of disbelief and fury. He raised his P-38 and fired towards the new attackers. A volley of return fire cut him down. He staggered, fell to one knee, then collapsed onto the gravel, his immaculate uniform staining dark with blood. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The surviving Germans surrendered. The clearing, now illuminated by the burning vehicles, was a scene from hell, littered with bodies, smoke, and the moans of the wounded. The major strode up to Miller, a grim smile on his face. "Captain Miller, looks like you started the party without us." Miller, leaning against the scorched hull of the command vehicle, could only shake his head. We thought we were the main effort." "You were the anvil," the major said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We were the hammer. Intelligence knew the forest was too hot for one team. Your mission was to get caught, to draw their attention. Ours was to follow your trail and hit them when they were focused on you. High Command didn't think you'd make it this far, to be honest. They thought you'd be wiped out in the bocage. What you did, it's a goddamn miracle." Miller looked around at the carnage, at the bodies of his men intermingled with the Germans. Caparzo was being tended to by Medic Wade, who had been freed. Luke was holding his daughter, both of them sobbing quietly. Of the 38 men who had entered the forest, he counted maybe 15 still standing. It was a victory, a tactical masterpiece, even. They had destroyed the command center of Panzergruppe West. The German counteroffensive would be stillborn. But as the first hints of dawn tinged the eastern sky with a bloody red, all Miller felt was a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion. The cost was etched on the faces of the survivors, in the empty spaces where friends had stood. He had saved a world of sanity, but he feared a part of him would forever remain in this green hell, in the Valley of Tears, and in this clearing of fire and blood. The war was not over, but this chapter, this brutal, soul-crushing push into the heart of darkness, was finally, terribly complete. He had survived. But the man who had huddled in that rain-soaked foxhole was gone, another casualty of the relentless gray rain of Normandy.